Hello again, AP people. I'm going to take a little bit of time today to talk about the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 and the Espionage and Sedition Acts of 1917 and 18, just to provide some comparison and some context for both and maybe clear up how they're maybe a little bit similar, maybe not quite so similar, even though the names are shared. All right, so to the left of your screen, you see the pudgy and bitter John Adams, and to the right of your screen, the slightly sour-faced Woodrow Wilson, and we'll use them as our backdrop for today. So let's start with the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798. So the Federalists, led by John Adams, kind of sweep into power after Washington leaves office. Right? Our American Cincinnatus is retired to Mount Vernon, and the leadership of the country is left in the hands of John Adams. And unfortunately for him, he's saddled with a bitter rival in his vice presidency, Thomas Jefferson. Now, Adams, in starting out his administration, one of the first things he has to deal with is the issue of the French. The French have essentially just resolved their revolution. There are new leaders in power, and Adams has to do something about it. One of the first things that happens in his administration is a pretty significant scandal, right? The XYZ affair. So I'm not going to really delve deeply into that because that's not our focus today, but let's suffice to say it's a diplomatic incident. Some representatives that Adams had sent over to deal with the French Foreign Minister Talleyrand had basically been told you have to pay some bribes in order to get an official conference with Minister Talleyrand. The Americans are very offended. It hits the U.S. press, and a lot of people are up in arms. There was kind of a fear that we would enter into something of a war with France. It amounts to a quasi-war, but it is something Adams has to deal with. And one of his methods of sort of coping with this crisis, because I mean it really was a scandal and something that had to be dealt with by his administration, was to pass a set of 4 acts. Right? And those 4 acts are mostly technically on paper targeted at French spies and warmongers, people who could be invading the country or infiltrating the United States in attempts to undermine his authority or American plans or defenses against the French. Right. So the first 3 are pretty non-controversial things. A Naturalization Act that had the added benefit of potentially keeping new immigrants out of the Jeffersonian Party. An Alien Enemies Act that could have theoretically deported people who supported the French, and an Alien Friends Act. Those 3 would make for a different video all on their own. The 4th is the one that really causes the problems. That's a Sedition Act. It includes some really specific language that limits speech that's criticizing Congress or the government or the president in particular. There's nothing in it that would defend the vice president from public critique, but I don't think Adams or his friends were too concerned about Jefferson being offended. Essentially, the Sedition Act in practice worked to prohibit criticisms of Adams and his Federalist friends in Congress. It wasn't ever really applied to French spies at all. Right? There really were not French invaders publishing in American newspapers about Adams's chubby face. Right? It just wasn't happening. The people that were critiquing Adams were Democratic Republicans. There's only a handful of people who are actually tried or charged under the Sedition Act, but they could potentially have received some jail time, 6 to 12 months, or really, really massive fines. Right? The folks who are prosecuted include a senator from Vermont, a man named Lyons. He's prosecuted, kind of publicly shamed a bit, made to pay some fines, and then he goes back home to cheers and hurrahs in Vermont. So it really doesn't damage his political career at all. the Alien Sedition Acts are strongly criticized for limiting free speech and violating the First Amendment. Some of its largest critics are James Madison and Thomas Jefferson, believe it or not. These lead directly to the passage of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Right? So that's Madison and Jefferson drawing up these documents that say states don't have to accept federal law if they have some problem with the law in question. Right? So in this case, any law that's limiting free speech. Right? Ultimately, John Adams loses his position, the Federalists lose power in Washington, and we could partially blame that on the Alien and Sedition Acts and some pushback against that. Once Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans come into power, the Alien and Sedition Acts are really just allowed to expire. The Naturalization Act is the only one that's repealed in the early 1800s. The other three just kind of passed into oblivion. Once Adams is out of power, there's really no need to renew it. And Jefferson, being such a vocal critic of it, wasn't publicly hypocrite enough to allow it to stand in his own defense. So the key things to know there are that it's passed and really technically kind of at a moment of potential war. There wasn't any immediate pressing threat of a French invasion or a French war. The TIF blows over, right? And it's pretty soundly in the press, and it's just allowed to pass into oblivion. Let's move on to Wilson and the Sedition Act of 1918 right now. The Sedition Act is kind of a clause that's added on to the Espionage Act of 1917, so often you don't see it existing by itself, and it's even a little hard to separate the two because they're really closely intertwined and they work together. The Espionage Act gives postal officials the authority to censor the mails if things that were critiquing the government or encouraging anarchy or encouraging men to dodge the draft were sent through the mails. Local postmasters could pull them out and press charges against people. The Sedition Act adds on to that by specifying the things that would be illegal in the mails or in any sort of public space. Okay? So it absolutely makes it illegal to criticize the government, the United States flag, military uniforms, the draft. It's enforced a lot more strenuously than the Sedition Act in 1798, particularly when it's targeting anarchists, communists, union members, anyone who was kind of upsetting the status quo or in any way impeding the war effort. One of the more interesting examples of it being applied is a film producer named Robert Goldstein. Before the declaration of war for World War I is given, he has produced this film called The Spirit of 76 about the American Revolution. And the film actually makes it to theaters after the declaration of war. Goldstein is charged under the Sedition Act because his portrayal of the British Redcoats makes them look negative and portrays them in a sort of ferocious light. Right? They're our enemies for 1776. But in 1917, they're our closest allies in Europe. So Goldstein is prosecuted for this, and he spends 10 years in prison and has to pay a $5,000 fine. So that's just kind of an interesting aside to have, I think. Some critics of the Sedition Act include Henry Cabot Lodge, who's generally not a huge fan of much of anything that Woodrow Wilson does, and former President Teddy Roosevelt. Unlike Adams's Sedition Act, the Act of 1918 is upheld in a Supreme Court case, Abrams versus the United States, 1919, and is essentially justified under the doctrine of clear and present danger. Right? So by 1918, the U.S. is actively involved in fighting in a foreign war. There are very real and immediate concerns about people not supporting the government or somehow undercutting the war effort. So by 1918, we are all in. And for anyone to be undercutting that at all was genuinely a problem and genuinely a concern. It wasn't just a matter of political disagreements, it was seen more as a matter of literal life and death for the people who were engaged in this fighting. This Sedition Act repealed in 1920, and some later court cases kind of established the idea that anything passed like that again would probably be considered unconstitutional. But you have to consider this act within its context, just like you do the Alien and Sedition Act of 1798. Right, so in comparing these two directly to one another, the Sedition Act of 1918 is during an active war, and the Alien and Sedition Act 1798 is during a potential war. Right, the threat is there, but no active conflict. The Alien and Sedition Act is applied sporadically and to one party, the dissenting party, those who aren't supporting the president and his administration. The Sedition Act of 1918 is applied more broadly, and it's impacting people who are from a variety of political backgrounds. So anarchists, communists, just anti-war folks in general, right? So they do have some different applications. Both of them heavily critiqued by leading figures of the day, and both of them eventually taken off the books. So I hope this was helpful in clearing things up a little bit. If you want to know more about any of the topics that I've mentioned briefly, just let me know, and I'll see what I can do to clear things up. Thanks, guys. I'll talk to you later.